Hello. I'm very sorry for being late and not being on the stand and hearing the opening remarks, but I'll try to be as brief as possible, not to stand between you and a coffee break, understanding that the longer I speak, the later we finish. I have been asked, for which I'm very grateful, to give this short talk on factors behind the growth of non-standard employment in Poland, and I need to disappoint everybody around here. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about what is actually non-standard employment in Poland. How it built up is not that important in terms of understanding what we can do about it onwards. So the thing is, you've heard already today from Jörg, and if you open any documents, you're going to find it there. Poland is like a shameful leader. Highest share of temporary workers in all Europe. It's extremely high. It's very worrisome. And it's been building up for years, so this shows you the share of temporary workers based on the LFS data. In service sector and manufacturing, it is high, right? The nice thing is there's a plateau, it doesn't seem to be increasing, but it is very high. Now, the thing is, if you just try to draw the unemployment rate on this, you see there is no direct link between like increasing labor market tension and then less temporary workers, or vice versa. These things tend to go the opposite ways, and the scale is not that comparable one between the other. So that tells you already there may be something misleading in trying to understand it's a very reckless employer labor market and poor workers cannot get a permanent contract. Now, there's also another thing that everybody picks up, which is that temporary workers are mostly young people. And that indeed tends to be true. This graph owes to the documents prepared by Piotr and Iga Magda at EBS. So this shows you the share of people with a permanent contract in 1997, which is kind of prior to where temporary contracts became popular. And it's like 90 people get a permanent contract, very nice. And then you look at 2012, and it's something between 35 and 55%. But the important part about this graph is it doesn't matter if you look at men or women, it doesn't look if you look at high skill or lower skill workers, it seems to be much lower for everybody. There is, of course, a very comforting thought. People 24, 25, 29 have higher shares of permanent contracts than the 5-year younger cohort. But in principle, the only difference we see is across these 5-year age groups. There is no difference for skills and there's no difference for genders. So it's like a universal discrimination of younger workers. They all get temporary contracts. You can look at the flip side of this, which is percent of people with temporary contracts. This is what it used to be in the late 1990s, and this is what it is right now, or was in 2012. And again, the story is the same. Of course, slightly older cohorts get slightly lower rates of temporary contracts, but this is an extremely high rate anyway. It's somewhere between 40 and 60%. So this is why everybody says it's a very bad thing. There's one more bad information, which is people with temporary contracts earn much lower wages, and this is something that owes to the documents prepared by the World Bank. So this is deciles of income distribution in 2001 and 2013, and you can look at which share in each decile are people with temporary contract and permanent contract. So it was permanent contract 2001, then something which is called voluntary permanent contract. Voluntary temporary contract. I'm going to explain better in a second. 2001, and that's the share of, income distribution of people with involuntary temporary contracts in 2001. Fast forward 10 years ahead, this is the image you're going to have. Majority of people with temporary contracts are people in the first 3 deciles of the income distribution. There's, of course, more in high income deciles. It's increased across the board, but it is much more concentrated among lower income earners than among higher income earners. Now, this distinction between voluntary and temporary, this is based on Polish LFS. There is a question if a person has a non-standard employment contract, if this is because that person wants it so, or because that person cannot find another job. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily say it's an involuntary contract to the extent we don't know what was the trade-off. Was it the trade-off between higher wage, lower wage, and a different contract? Or was it lower wage or no wage at all at a temporary contract? So we can't really say what this voluntary-involuntary split really means, but this is as good as it gets majority of temporary workers would like to have a majority of temporary workers would like to have a permanent contract, and most of them get much lower incomes. So this is why it's all very, 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 very bad story. Now, why I don't think this is the whole story, or why I'm going to try to convince you that this non-standard part of non-standard employment may be something we should pay slightly more attention to. Well, first of all, there's in every country a lot of legislation which specifies that some types of occupations or jobs need to be temporary contracts, which doesn't mean they're 3-month contracts or 2-year contracts. I'm a university professor and I have a 10-year temporary contract because it's supposed to be a tenure track way of thinking. Now, unfortunately, that thing in Poland is applied to all teachers, not just university teachers, and all medical stuff, not just university medical stuff. And if you just add up all teachers in a 40 million country, that builds up to a relatively large number. I'm not saying it explains the whole thing, but it's about 500,000 people, teachers alone. And there's also different professions which by law have temporary contracts. This is supposed to enforce tenure approach. Now, what we tried to do is we took the LFS data and we tried to look at who actually has which types of contracts. So the biggest, the blue bar, this is the 73%. This is people with open-ended contracts or permanent contracts. And then if we look at the remainder, not full 30%, of these people, this is in millions of workers in Polish labor market, wage earners. So in these people, there's a relatively large population, 800,000, which has a temporary contract of 2 years or more. Now, this isn't really a temporary contract. If you look at how long tenures are in Polish labor market, tenures meaning staying with one employer before you change the contract, this is something between 2 and 5 years, like in every other country, which means that a relatively large chunk of these people are not temporary by their own perception. It's just that on their contract it says it's temporary. Then there is about 2.5 million, which have something under 2 years of contract duration, and that's definitely the part that we could try to think as possibly hidden excessive power of the employers. So we did one more thing. Now, you've heard already from Jörg that Polish people change jobs a lot. And it's really much larger than in other countries of the European Union. Seeking causes of that is, of course, a huge research question, so I'm just going to give a small flashback. So let's look at people, not all people like here, but let's look at people who have only 1 year of tenure with the current employer. So this is people who have just started a job with that employer, freshly hired. Now, if the story about temporary work is true, what we would expect is that all of them have, or a vast majority of them have a temporary contract, right? Within 1 year, who would give you a permanent contract? Now, if you look at the data of people who changed a job within the last year, and I don't mean change occupation within the same employer, I mean change an employer. 1.3 million have already an open-ended contract. And as you see from the size of the slice, this is actually a half. So within 12 months of starting a new employment relation, 50% of people already have a permanent contract. Now let's look what's going to happen next. Now, we look at people under 12, and I can't really tell if this has been 3 months ago or 6 months ago from the labor force survey. I can know that last year that person had a different job than that person has right now. But the change of job could have happened anywhere between 1 and 12 months from the moment of questioning. So I'm not surprised to find that 900,000 people have a 12-month contract because they just started. And the route or the way of starting a new job in Poland is you get a trial contract, and then you get first temporary contract, and only then you get usually a permanent contract. I can't tell you that. They didn't answer. But okay, I'm going to go back to this.
When do I move from an open-ended contract if I get a good contract elsewhere? So that's not a fair comparison.
Okay, So the thing I think I wanted to emphasize is that it's a standard trajectory that if you start with a new employer, you have a trial contract, you have a temporary contract, and only then you get a permanent contract. And that holds even for very high rank positions.
Did you leave your position and resign for a temporary contract?
At the National Bank of Poland, for the first 2 years my work there was a temporary contract, and all my colleagues had a temporary contract.
I'm asking you right now, your tenure. Would you leave for a temporary contract?
So I tend to be very much in love with my employer. But I think we can continue that in private discussion. So what you're saying is that people only change jobs if they can get an open-ended contract.
No, if they have an open-ended contract, they only change if they get a better option.
And that better option,
Contract in general.
or a higher wage, or a more suitable job, or better working hours, or a whole lots of reasons for which you could change a job. Or you were fired.
But let's continue in the discussion. Okay?
So, so of people who changed the job within the last 12 months, there's only about something like, I'm not saying it's a small number, I'm saying it's 270,000 people, or something like 15%, who have a contract between 1 year and anything more, which is a temporary contract. So the people that didn't get a permanent position, they got a 1 year or 2 year or more temporary position. So looking at this data, it already shows you that if we really want to understand what is duality, there's a whole sorts of things we would like to know. And the bad news, unfortunately, is that we can't find that out because there's no data for the time being. One thing we would like to know, and I think that builds on what you were trying to argue, is what is actually not the percentage of people that have a temporary contract, but the percentage of people who would want a permanent contract, cannot get it, and, more importantly, are able to hold a permanent job. Because not all people that have a temporary job and cannot get a permanent contract are the ones who are experiencing duality from the side of workers. There's some people who just do not stay at the job which they're offered. They continue seeking further. They breach the temporary contract and move to a different employer. For a variety of reasons, could be working hours, could be working conditions, could be wages, could be opportunities to develop their human capital, whatever that is, they can be the breaking side as well. Now, the other things we would like to know is what's happening on the other side, which we usually don't see. We look at the labor force survey, sometimes we look at the structure of earnings survey, but this is all worker data, even if provided by the employer. What we do not know is what is actually the attitude towards giving permanent contract with the firms. What are the constraints? And I'm talking about data, not about the opinions that they express in media coverage. So this is the two parts that we're missing to actually understand the role of permanent and temporary duality in the Polish labor market. But unfortunately, this is not all of it. I showed you data from Labor Force Survey, and I talked about temporary contracts, but these temporary contracts are not necessarily employment contracts. The way the question is phrased in Polish Labor Force Survey is, do you have a contract of a fixed duration? And that can also be a civil law contract, which is not an employment contract. Now, that involves that there is no labor code involved, and that there is also no social security involved, and maybe that's the group we should really want to look at. We can't look at them if we want to look at Labor Force Survey, which is why we try to find some other data. And there is also the second caveat, which is some people simply do not get jobs. They're forced, perhaps, to start their own business and operate as contractors rather than workers. And that, again, involves issues related to job security, social security, and all that other stuff. So this is the second part of the duality story that we can't overlook if we want to understand it well. And gladly, there is some data. It's a snapshot, but it's useful. So this graph shows you the number of men and women that had a civil contract in 2013. This is in thousands. So you can see that, again, same story. Majority is focused on 20 to 29 age group. But these are not millions. These are hundreds of thousands. I'm not saying it's very small, but if you integrate that graph, you're going to end up with 800,000 individuals in a labor market which gives jobs to 15.7 million people. So it doesn't seem to be the driving part. Just to give you a sense of the size. I'm not saying it's not problematic because it's small, I'm just saying it's not very large.
So what is the source of the data?
Can I answer in the break? It's social security data. This gives you information on people. So this was this. This is the share in that age group that has ever been covered by Social Security, but has in 2013 had a civil contract. Now, I personally fit into this age group, unfortunately, already, and I also have a lot of civil contracts during the year because some of the stuff I do, when people ask me to do the right to tax or whatever, they offer me a civil contract, even though I'm a full-time employee at the University of Warsaw National Bank of Poland. So what I'm trying to say, again, is that this number doesn't say these people have no Social Security. I'm saying among those people, some people have no Social Security. And probably the problem of Social Security coverage is focused somewhere here and not all around here. But then again, this is just guessing. So this shows you the industry distribution. And again, these percentages need to be taken with a lot of caution. So imagine a firm. A firm has 25 employees and wants to set up a new building for its premises. So it hires on a civil contract a group of 4 architects and contract supervisors, construction site supervisors. These people are on civil contracts, but they provide short-term service, a specialized one, to that firm. If you take that firm and ask that firm to give you a ratio of number of people that get civil contracts divided by the number of workers, they will provide you with a number of 5/25, which is 20%. But it doesn't say that that firm has stopped 20% of its staff from getting a permanent job. That firm does completely different work than architecture or construction. And it's just this short period of time when this firm is, for example, expanding and hiring architects and contractor site supervisors. Same goes for lawyers, same goes for consultants, same goes for all kinds of jobs that we're used to being provided by professionals. So these percentages can't really be taken like at face value. The important part is, of course, this here, administrative and support service activities. Now, I've checked just to make sure, I double-checked and I checked again. And the thing is, if you look at NACE classification of activities, because it's following NACE classification of activities, temporary job, temporary work, temporary employment agencies, they actually fall on here. Now, if you look at Polish law, there is law on temporary employment agencies, and this law says that they are obliged, full stop, whatever, no exceptions, to hire on a contract, which is an employment contract, not a civil law contract. There's no flexibility left here. But if you talk to temporary employment agencies, they're going to tell you that the markups in this market are so small because they provide mostly workers with so low skills that they can't survive if they obey the law. So what they do is they go around the law. There's a variety of contractual agreements they make, which makes them like de jure temporary employment agencies, but de facto they provide service different than what's under NACE category. So this is a really problematic part. But then again, if you look at the numbers and how many people is actually having a civil contract there, it's about 130,000. If you ask in the labor force survey the number of people who declare that they work via a temporary employment agency, it's something between 80 and 90,000 individuals. So then again, it doesn't seem to grow into millions. Now, one more thing I tried to do is to look at this graph in the perception of what is actually Polish economy. So I don't care about these percentages if they reflect the structure of economy, right? Because that would be something proportional. So then we may want to decrease the proportion, but there is no sector in which the problem's concentrated, so there is no direct indication on what policy should be employed. So what I did is I computed you see the indicators here. I just told you not to trust them, but you see the indicators here. And I computed the share of like legal, of course, labor code, employment contracts across the same sectors. Now, if you have one share, you divide it by the other, you can get something which is called an overrepresentation, underrepresentation ratio. So if the shares are equal, you get a 1, and that 1 tells you it's exactly the same representation. And this is what you see in this graph. So the nice part is that most of the sectors are actually very close to one. There's two exceptions. One is, as we already discussed, administration services, and that's probably or partly due to temporary employment agencies. And the other one is accommodation and fund services, in other words, tourism. And I don't think anybody who ever done anything in temporary and permanent work is surprised to see that the problem's concentrated there. But then again, it's highly seasonal, it's highly atypical. Maybe we need to understand the nature better. So I did one more thing, which is try to relate this ratio to the size of the population that reports, or Social Security reports, that they've been working on a civil contract in that industry. And that's this. So on the horizontal axis, you have the number of people, and on the vertical axis, you have the ratio. And if you look at 1, this is where you would see that the people that have a civil contract have the same representation across industries as people that have an employment contract. And you clearly see that the exceptions is this is the administration, and these two. Now they are, for one thing, very small, and for another thing, quite atypical, because one of them is arts, entertainment, and recreation. And the other one, as I already discussed, the accommodation and tourism, basically. So it seems that the civil contracts are an important story, but not as a whole. We need to be much more focused on what we're looking. Now, how about self-employment? The numbers that everybody will tell you is that in Poland, share of self-employment is 20%. It's comparable to Greece and Italy. It's highest in Europe, and it's bad. Now, half of it is people self-employed in their agriculture. If you have a minute during the break and you can try to explain to me what the hell is a person self-employed in the agriculture, I would really appreciate it. We used to call it a farmer, but now it's a self-employed in the agriculture. And Poland has a big agriculture sector, so that is not a problem. So cancel out the half of it. What about the other half? The other half is still large. If you compare self-employment rate in the other half to, say, Germany, a similar country with a similar climate, you would see that in our country it's 5 percentage points higher, so maybe there is some forced self-employment that we should be worried about. The other number, The other number you may want to look at is the change in the rates of the self-employment, men and women across different educational levels. Now, where would you expect to find entrepreneurs? Among people who only have primary education or people with some higher level of skills? Now, typically, we think about entrepreneurship as people, at least the jack of all trades, so at least secondary education. Now, for one thing, there is a increase across the board, but the second thing, the biggest increase is for people with primary education. And that's some education that tells you maybe for some low-skilled workers, it's not, it's the force of the employer or the bargaining position of the employer that allows him to say, I'm not offering a job contract, I'm going to have you as a subcontractor, as a separate legal entity that provides services rather than a worker that provides employment or work. So can we look into this contracting as a possible source of pushing it too far? Let's just call it this way. So one thing we can try to do, and that's what we do at the National Bank of Poland, is we can try to ask, and I'm sure you can't see anything on that graph, it's too small, but I'll try to explain, I'm sorry. We try to ask employers if they use any outsourcing or subcontracting. And the long dark bar that you see to the right, this is the share of firms that say, yes, we do. Now, the short and lighter bar is the share of employment that they do this way. So basically, reading this, everybody's doing it, but for a small share of the workers. And you can look at distributions. It's again, mostly the distributions are condensed at 0, and then a small percentage. There's almost nobody going beyond 20% of their employment. So it doesn't seem to be a very big phenomenon. Now, the left-hand side shows you the share in the labor force survey ever since 2008. Individuals who run companies answer the question if they provide service to just one buyer or to multiple buyers. That's not a good measure, but it's the best we can do for finding somebody who's actually a contractor. If you're only providing to one firm, you're probably not doing this business because you want to. And these lines are fairly flat. They don't seem to respond to unemployment. This is 2008 and this is 2013. There's been a change in unemployment, increase in unemployment. There's no change here. If anything, there's a small increase. Different colors respond to different sectors. The lowest bar is the manufacturing, so the lowest line. Highest are for service and for construction and for overall. But the most important part, which again you can't see, so I need to explain for you, is of course the numbers on this axis. And these numbers are 0.4% here of the labor force and 1.4% here of the labor force. So no matter which side you look from, if you ask the employers or if you ask labor force, it's not a huge phenomenon. It's there, it's visible, but it doesn't seem to be very large. So I'm wrapping it up, it's the last slide. So can we explain all this that I've just showed to you with the labor code? I find it very hard to believe. For one thing, there's been a huge increase in fixed-term contracts or temporary contracts, and then a plateau, even though there's been changes in unemployment, changes in the labor code. We don't know anything about the changing nature of temporary contracts between, say, early 2000s and right now, and that may be something that we need to understand better to know if it's a problem or not. If that were a problem of the labor code, why would 50% of freshly employed get a permanent position already within 12 months, at the most, of tenure? And if that's not convincing, the last argument is a recent research paper that we've done at the bank, which shows there's absolutely no flexibility in the responsiveness of employment to shocks in GDP and the changes in the labor code in Poland. So whatever has been happening does not seem to translate to stronger or weaker transmission of GDP impulse to employment. Positive or negative, doesn't matter. Now, can we explain with the tax wedge? As you see from this graph, tax wedge is highly dispersed. It's again a graph that owes to the research done at IBS. But the most important part is it doesn't seem to change that much with that time. Why I'm saying this? This graph shows you the changes in the tax wedge over time from 1995 to 2013. Now, there's one story here, and that story is a decreasing tax wedge. And we've seen an increase in the use of flexible instruments. So if that was an explanation, that would be a very peculiar one. Summarizing, and I'll try to give credit right now to Jan Rutkowski, who tried to teach me some economics, but it didn't work too well. There's World Bank lingo that they use to explain stuff to people. And that lingo is you try to answer the question of what, how do we know this, why is it so, so what? What, there's definitely some scope for duality, but it's not where we had our spotlight. How do we know this? Because the data does not seem to confirm any common beliefs that we had about it. At least that's my reading of the data. Why is it so? We looked so much at the usual suspects, we forgot to perhaps find different explanations of the different stories. Can I just finish last bullet? Thank you. And the last bullet is, I don't know how to solve this problem, but Piotr will today in the afternoon. Thank you very much.